thank you for tuning in to the Logic of God podcast. I'm Cody.
I'm Gina.
And I'm Ben.
If you're returning, thank you for coming back. And if you are a new guest, welcome.
So, are all doubts the same in severity?
As in, are some types of doubts worse than others?
I think we tackled that already. If you're questioning God's character,
Yes.
or the resurrection, I think you're teetering on heretical. I know that's harsh, but
Yeah. But
It's not because we're trying to be exclusive. It's that if you don't label something in truth for resolution, then you get into this wishy-washy, you're still a Christian and you're still going to go to heaven even if you don't believe in Jesus. Does the Bible really say that? It sucks to say that. And that's not to say that you can't be redeemed from the doubts that you're having if you are in a position of questioning the existence of God and the truth of the resurrection. But you have to identify it and call it what it is. And that does potentially exclude you. I would say it does exclude you from salvation if you deny the cross.
yeah. And and I think that goes back to, are you innocent till proven guilty or guilty till proven innocent? Because there are different theories on the resurrection of Christ. And, to me, they don't make a lot of sense, but one of them, like the swoon theory, it can trip you up and you're like, oh, did that really happen? Or the most plausible one is the alien theory that Jesus was an alien, but there's different logical routes you can take to get to this. There's different theories that you can question whether that has any validity. But again, is it the innocent till proven guilty or guilty till proven? God didn't raise from it because I just learned about this new one. I'm going to prove them wrong. Or, okay, I need to go to scripture and go to historical fact and see if this actually happened.
Prayerfully.
Yes.
In humility. It's all about your heart posture, I think.
And I do think it's worth differentiating that doubt is not denial, but it does lead to it if it's not addressed.
Yep.
God opposes the proud. If you are going in as a doubter, deliberately attempting to discredit scripture or Christ, like your pride is making you God's adversary. And Cody said before, do I want to be on God's side at the end of my life, even if I don't fully understand it, or do I want to be in this other camp that isn't on God's side? I don't want to stand against God. I don't know about you.
I agree. So, are there doubts that are spiritual in nature, or are all doubts intellectual or emotional?
That's a tough question for me. It's a very good one, but I don't know if I'm in tune spiritually enough, if my spirit is having doubts or if it is my intellect. I don't know if I can rightfully separate the two well enough to determine that.
So doubts that are spiritual in nature don't exclude spiritual warfare. You can hear the little whisper of the Holy Spirit encouraging you and edifying you and advocating for you. But you can also hear little whispers of, I really want to do this thing. I really want to say this thing to this person because they really made me mad. And I just want to tell them to go to hell. But we have temptation, and sometimes it's just ourselves, but sometimes it's spiritual in nature. And I think if we allow things to take root in us that are not godly, doubts can be spiritual in nature in the dark way.
I think another way of asking this question, which I did elsewhere on this outline, I probably should have asked it this way. Are all doubts our own fault?
We are the result of our life exists, like our story. And I know personally the trauma that I have has given me a lot of doubt in myself, in my family, in my friends, in my abilities, and also sometimes in my faith. My trauma is not my fault, but if I'm not taking my thoughts captive and I'm not attacking doubts from the perspective of honoring God and obeying God, then my doubts are my fault because I've allowed it to snowball into something it shouldn't have been. But I think also, like, we all have a story. We all have experiences. People have spoken over us things that have planted little seeds that have been really hard to get rid of. And I would say that's not our fault. Tell me I'm wrong.
I don't know. We're responsible for our own walk to a certain extent. So in that sense, yes, you take like the Ravi Zacharias, not necessarily that people even had faith in him, somebody who seemed like such a powerhouse for God does something so just evil in nature secretly and is two-faced while doing this. That definitely can put doubts in people's minds. And I don't necessarily think that's their fault. And then there's also this aspect of, thanks to the sin of Adam and Eve, of perpetual divine hiddenness in our sense. So it almost, faith is part of the salvific work that has a process. And you can't have that with full knowledge. So doubt or skepticism, I don't think we can escape.
I do think that a lot of our doubts do come from us. I do think there is also a spiritual enemy that is constantly looking for any advantage he can get, and so is constantly probing your defenses and finding your weaknesses. And like we said before, this is an opportunity for you to grow stronger. Those doubts aren't your fault necessarily, because it's not you actively seeking for something to not believe in. When those doubts come up, your choice to accept them makes the doors. Just like with temptation. If you're a married man walking down the street and you see an attractive woman, there are going to be things that jump into your head that are not your fault. It is your choice to dwell on them and accept them and make them yours, or to reject them and move on with your life. And so it's the same with doubt. Now, at the same time, there are a lot of people who have been mistreated by the church. And again, I think there is a very good reason for why God put so many warnings about false teachers and false prophets, and about the punishment that waits for them for leading people into hell with them, for dragging people down. And in the case of Ravi, I think he's a very good example, because so many of his teachings were good, but then he turns out to have been something of a moral monster in the latter years of his life, and who knows how long that was going on. And so there were people who were brought to Christ through Ravi and his testimony. And then they find out that he's a monster. And then you rightfully think, well, he wrote books on marriage. Mike Winger had an episode where he was just throwing away Ravi's books on marriage because I can't teach this stuff. Like, part of our testimony is living by example. And so when it turns out that we didn't live by the example we're setting for other people, what exactly is that example being set for us? And so those doubts that spawn from that, I do understand, and those are not your fault. They aren't. That's why God puts such a big emphasis. Do not, anyone who causes one of these little ones to stumble. Those little ones don't understand the way the world works yet.
We were those little ones. That's us. That's everybody. We were all children.
Mm-hmm. At one time, we needed the milk, not solid food, and somebody poisoned the well. That's on you. And yes, it's true. In the end, you do need to address your own doubts. No one can do that for you. People can help you along. You have to do it for you. But absolutely, it is not your fault if someone has done something to you. And it's caused you to doubt the goodness of God because someone hurt you.
Yeah. If I doubt God's goodness or his existence as a Christian, have I fallen away from the faith?
That's still a tough one. We've touched on it a few times here. Again, it depends on what you do. Because, again, when you go into the Old Testament in order to eradicate different peoples, you think, how could a loving God do that? That's something that all of us, if we're being honest at one time or another, have questioned. But there's a difference between, like you said, Cody, guilty until proven innocent or innocent until proven guilty. When you say, Lord, I know you're good. I know it. I've experienced your goodness. And I've seen your commandments to love one another all throughout Scripture. I see this, and this seems so horrible. Why? That's a reasonable thought. But to be content with just questioning and never getting the answer because you're afraid of what the answer will be, That's where we start to get into dangerous territory. Because to question and then deny the goodness of God, that's where you fall away from the faith. You can't deny the goodness of God and be a Christian. You can't say, God is mostly good, but I think he's done some things wrong.
What about, this is something I've struggled with on and off for about 2 years. What about the doubt of God cares about this? Or God, like, God is in doubting that God is in every single detail or like of your life, or that blaming God for something bad that has happened, or accusing God of not preventing something that has happened that's hurt you or made you sad. Would you consider that to be a form of doubt?
No. I think Job was angry with God. He didn't doubt that God was good. He was angry. And again, what's always fascinated me about the story of Job is the fact that God doesn't punish Job for being angry, and he still considers him a righteous man at the end of everything. I think there are a lot of bad things that happen to us that we don't deserve, quote unquote. We didn't do something in a negative to merit that negative response. Bad things do happen to us sometimes that we just don't seem to deserve. And in those moments, it is understandable to lash out in anger. And God understands that, and he still loves you. There's a reason why God, instead of lashing out at Job, lashes out at his friends who told him he did something wrong. But instead of lashing out at Job, he explains that something he already knew, but he just shows him. And I think that's in a way symbolic. God can use these situations that are dark to show you who he is. And you being real with him and opening yourself up and being angry is an opening for him. But if you reject his response, that's where it becomes an issue. But I think you guys can speak a bit more clearly to this, because I haven't had quite as many experiences like that. Granted, I've had my brother's death, but
that's a big one. You have experiences.
Not as many, I think.
The problem of evil is probably our culture's biggest question right now. Is God a moral monster question, with the aspects of the Israelite conquests of Canaan and the idea of eternal conscious torment, hell. Is God a moral monster? And that is something that I think every Christian of today faces, and something that you have to in some way answer. And in Job's instance, he basically just gives him the answer of, I'm God, and you have to trust that I am who I say I am, and I am good. And some people can't accept that answer, and that's hard.
Mm-hmm. I think for myself, I never, when I was going through the period of my brother's death, I didn't really struggle with the goodness of God. My struggle was different. I didn't want to mourn my brother or his loss, because I thought that would be rejecting God's goodness. I thought that I genuinely did believe that God existed and God was good and that God was just. Whatever happened to my brother was right. And a part of me felt guilty if I mourned him, if I mourned the loss, if I admitted that it was bad what happened. And if I felt angry, or if I felt like in any way he was mine to lose. And so for about a year or so after his death, I didn't really face it. And I didn't realize until much later it was wrong for me to do that. That's not what God wanted from me. And that I was lying to him and I was lying to myself by doing that. There are bad things that happen in this world. And you don't choose the emotional responses you have. We don't. We can't. To try to choose the emotional response that you're having is to lie. I lied. I lied to God, and I lied to myself, and I lied to everyone in my family when I said that I was okay, that I was at peace with what was going on. I wasn't. You have to be real with yourself and God and everyone else. And you will find peace in that. That is the stepping out in faith. That is choosing not to doubt. The choosing of doubt is to reject it. And in that way, I spent a year in doubt.
Thank you for sharing, because I know that's not an easy subject.
It's gotten easier over the years. But the only way it got easier is by actually talking about it honestly.
Yeah.
And that isn't to say that you should open your heart up to every single person in the world. But I trust you guys and I love you guys. And I think it's valuable to the people listening to know God doesn't want you to shut up when bad things happen. And he doesn't want you to become an emotionless monster or just a joy happiness machine.
There's so much bad doctrine or just thought that people spew out around death. And I think everybody has experienced death in one way or another. People, especially in the Christian world, oh, you should be happy because you know where they're going. That's not biblical.
What about God needed them in heaven?
They're watching over you now. They're in a better place. Like, none of that's good. None of that's biblical. Jesus going into raising Lazarus from the dead wept, even though he knew exactly what he was going to do moments later. That is an example that we could take. God doesn't like death. You don't have to like death. You don't have to like sin or bad stuff that happens. Like, death is a result of sin. You don't have to like it. You don't have to be okay with it. And I think that's, in your instance, like, I could see that's something that you picked up along the way, and like something that we did too. And people constantly told us that the 3 babies that we lost, at least you have the kids that you do, just love them more. Mm-hmm. It's like, that doesn't help. That's not true. That's not good.
You need to have people in your life who will just weep with you.
We didn't get that. We wept with other people because of it.
And if there's one good thing to come out of any of that's it, the fact that you can now weep with other people. You don't have to give them the empty platitudes. And let's face it, they are empty. It's people trying to help.
It's the most harmful thing I've ever seen.
They feel like there has to be a nugget of wisdom for every single thing that ever happens.
There is senseless crap, like just like nonsense, like so much in life that is just like, why? And if we get trapped in that like pain and we don't express it, and then we cover it up because we want to look like a good Christian.
Or even because we're afraid we're insulting God in some way. I'm glad you brought up the story in John, because that's literally the story that changed my mind on the idea of grief. Death is the ultimate violation of life, and life is the most beautiful thing that we're given. It's the first gift we're given, and it's the last thing taken from us. And it doesn't matter that it's a part of God's plan, that God can use it. The truth is that Christ himself saw, even though he was about to bring Lazarus back, the true violation, the horrible nature of death. And if he himself, the one who has power and authority over it, wept over the fact that a friend of his died who he was literally going to bring back 5 minutes from that, what do you have to not mourn? You don't have a right not to mourn. You have to.
Being made in the image of God, like, our emotions are reflective of that. And it's not honoring to our Creator to bury those emotions. Like, we want to take our thoughts captive, but it doesn't say that we have to be so controlled that we're unfeeling.
And there's different instances. Like, again, cancer is very prevalent in today. And if you've had a loved one experience that, you know how much pain they go through while having cancer. And you can be happy that they're not in pain anymore, but that doesn't mean you have to be happy that they're dead as well.
Mm-hmm.
I know a young girl whose father just passed away from a very long battle with cancer. And I know she's never going to be the same, because she loves her father and wants him in her life. And there are key moments that he's not going to be there for. And it would be so dishonoring to his fight to then say, it's okay that he's not here for my graduation and my wedding and my first time buying a home and teaching me how to do things. Like, that's not honoring to his memory to if she were to say, it's fine. Because it's not. Clearly it's not. Jesus had so many examples of death, cruel death, not just like natural causes. Lazarus was natural causes, but John the Baptist was horrible. And that was his precious cousin that he was close to. And if you read scripture, Jesus says, if you're going to be like any man, be like John the Baptist. I would argue that John the Baptist was one of Jesus's favorite people ever. And he was brutally murdered. And Jesus grieved that too. We have the right and ability to grieve hard situations, and not just like earthly death, but the death of hopes and dreams and the death of a chapter in our life, or just hard times where things don't go our way.
So I mentioned Joy Lewis before. Joy Lewis was the wife of C.S. Lewis. I'm pretty sure everybody knows who C.S. Lewis was. If you don't, you really should look him up. He's an amazing child author and Christian author. There's a point in Joy Lewis's life where she developed cancer and she was dying. And her son, Douglas, had found this out, and he was walking, I believe, home. I can't remember if it was home or to the hospital, but he was passing by these church grounds, and he felt compelled to go into the church and pray. And he talked about how he opened up the gate to this church, and he passed it, and it felt like he was passing from the Shadowlands into the real world, into a world more real than any he'd ever experienced. And he sat down at the church in the pews and started praying, and he felt the presence of the Lord there with him. And he said what he felt was immeasurable grief at the fact that his mother was dying, that God was mourning with him, and was actually mourning worse than however much grief, which was immeasurable, that he was feeling. And he felt the Lord say, I can take this from you if you want it. And he said yes. And his mom went into remission. He left, and he felt the Lord say, it's going to be fine. She'll be okay. Years later, the cancer came back. And once again, he felt compelled to go to this church, and he went in. And once again, he felt the Lord with him. He felt the grief of the Lord. And once again, he was asked, I can take this from you if you want it. And this time, he said, your will be done, and he left. He knew in his heart now was the time, for whatever reason and however horrible it was. And despite the fact that the Lord was still grieving the fact that this evil was happening, now was the time. The Lord's grieving with you, and he does have a plan for it. It doesn't make it good. It doesn't make it okay. It doesn't. But you have to know he's there with you. And he's not doing this to punish you or because he hates you.
We always want people to be God, like this physical representation of what we want God to be. And it never really pans out. People always disappoint. But when you can sit and experience what he has for you, like in your soul, it's very freeing.
So, moving on to the next one. Went a little bit off topic there, but it was good.
Just a little bit.
Are there some doubts that will never go away?
That's such a hard question because we can't predict the future.
I feel like the answer is yes.
Yeah.
I feel like there are some things you're just never going to be 100% certain on. For me, this actually does go back to the discussion of Genesis. There's always the possibility in my mind that it could be that Genesis isn't literal.
I want to point out that you're a scientist by trade.
I wouldn't call myself that. I got a bachelor's in physics, but that's about as far as that goes.
But that's a science degree.
Yeah, a bachelor's.
You have, okay, let me rephrase. I want to point out that you have a scientist mind. You're very logical and analytical. For you to take creation as a 6-day literal story is, to me, miraculous.
When you were getting your bachelor's degree, was not everything that you were taught and learned directly against the 6-day creation?
Oh, absolutely.
Theory? Okay. But you still believe in 6-day creation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's like very miraculous.
I appreciate that. For me, it's a pretty easy thing to say that I believe in. There was a time where I struggled with it a lot more than I do now. And like I said, to an extent, there's always a measure of uncertainty for me. I wouldn't call it doubt. It's more like you said, Cody. If I'm wrong, okay. But I think I'm not afraid to look stupid on this. There are a lot of people who have scientific backgrounds. They'll say, that's the dumbest thing ever. What are you talking about? The Earth very clearly wasn't made a little over 6,000 years ago. Are you an idiot? Are you gullible? Are you stupid? There was a time where I was afraid of that. Now I'm not. Like, what? No.
Yeah, I think there is a realm, so there's doubt, skepticism, but there is a realm of just mystery that is, not the doubt of like double-mindedness or unwillingness to, learn truth, but there is still mystery involved or plausibility.
I think that there are a number of solid explanations for different areas in the Bible. Some of them are stronger than others. There are different explanations, for example, for why God ordered the extermination of the Canaanites and why that would be acceptable. There are some people who talk about how they weren't fully human because they were part Nephilim and there had been a kind of breeding in that area. And so it was acceptable to wipe them all out because they weren't human. And they point to the fact that Goliath of Gath is one of the areas that they were supposed to take out. They didn't fully exterminate the people in Gath. And they talk about giants inhabiting the land of Canaan. And Goliath was a pretty tall dude. And that's not something that's normally humanly possible. That's an understandable explanation, but that's not a fully satisfying explanation for a lot of people. There's also the fact that we are literally told in Genesis that God says to Abraham that your descendants will have to be out of Canaan because the people here have not reached their full measure of sin. God is making it clear in whatever way. We don't fully understand the sin of the Canaanites. We're not told, but we are told that there is a measure of sin that's there and that it hasn't reached its full measure and that eventually it does. We don't understand why that applies to children. I think it's pretty easy for us to think, okay, men and women, all right, why children?
Okay, I want to ask a question really quick.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
I don't want to ruin your train of thought.
Oh, go for it.
Is the value on children so much higher than that of adults?
Because children are innocent.
Thank you.
No problem. Is that a satisfying answer? Do you?
Yeah, no, it's something I've been thinking about. So
we're not all like our Calvinist friends thinking that children are sinful, wretched beings.
Mm-hmm. There are some people who take the more Calvinist position of there are no innocents in this world except the people God makes innocent. And okay, that's an explanation. It could be true. I don't buy that.
There's an added layer of protection for children according to God, but then Satan and even like the occult has a very strong emphasis on children and taking advantage and all of that. So like I'm just processing some of the things you just said.
So one of the reasons for why death is such a horrible thing is because it's the ultimate corruption of life. One of the reasons that specific evils done to children are so horrendous is because it's the ultimate corruption of innocence. A baby is one of the few things that we as humans are capable of creating that is truly pure and beautiful. And there's no evil in it that you could see. There's no maliciousness. That's developed over time. That's what I would argue anyway.
It's learned.
Yeah. Either through our nature as we develop and as we listen to our worst instincts. But I think the evil that churns our stomachs, or at least I think for us here, the evil that churns our stomachs the most is the people who attempt to introduce sexual perversion to children.
Yeah.
Because that is the ultimate robbing of innocence. It's a kid who has no conception of what it is that you're trying to introduce to them. In fact, most of the time where I hear people who've grown up and had that kind of thing happen to them when they were younger, they feel as a child something is wrong. Somehow there's something inside of them that says this isn't good, that we lose as we get older. I think God has a very special relationship with children. There's a reason we're told we must become like a child to enter the kingdom of God. More reasons than one. But yes, that innocence is beautiful. And sadly, we all lose it at some point, and we have to. But how we lose it is important. And if it's forcibly taken and replaced with evil, that's horrifying. And so that goes to our thoughts when we look at the destruction of the Canaanites. Did that include the children? Seemingly, yes. There are people who make arguments that no, the children weren't included in that. And besides, the Israelites didn't even do it anyway. They didn't wipe out all the people in Canaan. And they suffered for it. Because the practices of the Canaanites kept coming back. And they kept turning away from God and sacrificing their own children to the fire.
Yeah, that one for me, like I understand why people struggle with it, but if you're a Christian and you believe that we're all going to be judged anyway, and God holds that judgment, I don't get the big, if you believe he's a just and fair judge, then whether it happens sooner or later.
I think the tough thing is that there seem to be universal, unbreakable things that seem to be wrong, that just by their nature are wrong. I think we can all generally agree. There are certain actions we can take. I don't want to list them here
Like
because
morality, you mean?
yeah, there are moral issues that are just, this is never an okay thing. And we talked about the corruption of children, the introduction of sexual evil to a child is, in my book, unforgivable. It's horrifying. And yet, one of these things, the killing of children, that we would generally say is unacceptable. And if we heard about anyone who did it, we'd say, okay, no, that's just terrible. Killing babies, no, don't do that. That's evil. That's something that seemingly God orders. And there are people who make the argument he didn't. And there are people who make the argument he did, but they were part Nephilim or they weren't fully human or any number of other things. And there are people who make the argument from the Calvinist position that no one is innocent, therefore it was acceptable to kill them all. Going back to the original question, are there things we're always going to be uncertain about? There are any number of answers to this question that could be right. And there are a number of different answers that have been satisfying to me on this question, but never fully. And so my 100% honest answer for this question in particular is that I don't know. Mm-hmm. I know that God sets it up to where the evil of the people of Canaan was unique, but we're not told what it was. And we're told, for good reason, God removed everyone who was good from Canaan because the people there weren't evil enough to warrant killing. We're told about Sodom and Gomorrah. If there are 10 righteous people, I'll spare the cities. So we're shown enough times that God is good and that God is merciful and God wouldn't order the execution of an entire people unless there was a reason for it. So whatever the reason is, I know there was one, and I'm content with that. But like I said, I don't know the reason why. Not certainly, anyway.
Yep.
So if someone gives into doubt and leaves the church, are they gone for good? I think, is the question really, are they still saved?
I think we can split it into two different things. One, are they still saved? Or two, if they are no longer saved, is there no hope for them?
We haven't covered this yet, but do we need to talk about, and we don't need to for this episode, do we need to talk about at some future point the idea of once saved, always saved?
We covered it in our Calvinism episode. It would be something I think we might want to focus on in more depth in another episode, but it's worth covering here regardless.
Because we've heard a lot of different things said on this topic of people who have left churches in our lifetime. And a lot of it is just, were they really saved to begin with? And it drives me up a wall because if you have somebody who's hurting enough to leave the church because they're struggling so badly in their doubt, and you're just going to say, you probably weren't saved to begin with, that is such a horrible way to treat that person. Like, it is not my place to judge somebody else's salvation. I can certainly guide them and encourage them, teach them and lead them if they want it. But for me to say, listen, you're struggling, you're going to go to hell. Like, that's horrible. Who does that? But we've heard it so many times. And if you sit down and have a conversation about it, then they probably would feel really bad. But my goodness, how could you treat somebody like that? Especially knowing the questions and doubts I've had and he's had and the ways that we've been treated because of it.
There are definitely enough stories going around of people who've been mistreated by their church, or church leadership that turned out to be corrupt, or church leaders who sold their congregation a bill of false goods and then their worlds fell apart for any number of reasons. And then they felt like everything that they were taught then had to have been false. For those people, it's tough to say whether or not they're saved. And you're right, Gina, it's not our place to say if they're saved or not. I think God has a measure of compassion for those people.
People don't leave churches because God is bad. People leave churches because people are bad. And if they have gone into a church and they have been fed water instead of milk, or they have been fed milk exclusively, and then they've said, I need more, and the pastor isn't equipped to give them the more that they're looking for, they might leave. And here's the kicker. They might go to a different church. Just because they left your church doesn't mean that they're not saved. It just means that your church wasn't the right fit for them.
Yeah, there's the question, did they just leave your church? And then there's the question, did they leave the church, the capital C church?
C.
If they leave the capital C church, the big C church, Are they still saved? If they lash out in anger and they say, I don't believe in any of these things anymore because everything I was told was a lie, are they still saved?
Is your hope in man or is your hope in the Lord? That person has to personally evaluate that.
I think there's a sense that you can deconstruct, and people talk bad about deconstruction. And
thank you for bringing it up.
I think deconstruction's great.
What is deconstruction?
Basically taking what you've learned and dismantling it. And some people take it as far as you're just going to throw everything away and not pursue truth. And that's not what deconstruction should look like, just throwing everything away. But there is a sense when you grow up in a house and you're taught something, like you feed off of your parents or whoever is leading you's opinions until you're able to make your own. There's having kids, like parents will realize this, that you're your kid's hero to a certain extent. They want to be just like you. They follow you around everywhere. Like most of what you say, they won't question until they're, teenagers and terrible human beings. No, I'm just kidding.
They're the devil.
Yeah, but they won't question you. They'll take everything as truth. Even if it's not truth, they'll take it as truth. And once you come to the realization of that as a human being, whether you're leaving your house and going to college or it happens in your 30s or 40s, you still have to make what you've learned yours one way or another. And there is going to be some pieces of that house that don't fit because they weren't built on truth or they weren't built on the foundation. And if you go into deconstruction as more of a remodel or a reconstruction, you'll be much more successful.
I just can't emphasize enough how many times people want that physical manifestation of God, and they look to pastors or other individuals to be that for them because they need something tangible, that somebody they can ask questions to, somebody that they can be accountable to, because God's not striking them down with lightning bolts and booming to them in the dark of the night. We don't have that. We all wish that we did. And by going through deconstruction myself, I have been able to identify when it's God's voice and when it's somebody else's. And that's the most important part to me, is that discernment, because I've gone down some rabbit holes that were not healthy. So I don't know, like watching you go through deconstruction as a brand new Christian was terrifying to me. But then going through it myself has been a little bit more mellow. But you've set a very good example. So I don't know. I really like that you brought it up. It's not something people talk about.
No, or it's talked about, in the Christian circle. Oh, it's bad. Don't do it by any means. Like, you need to encourage young Christians to make the faith their own. Mm-hmm. If you're not doing that and you're saying, oh, doing that's bad, you shouldn't do it. That's why you see young kids leave and don't come back. That's why the population is not coming back, because you're not open to questions. You're not open to skepticism. You're not open to answering questions that everybody has that you just don't want to acknowledge are there.
You're either not knowledgeable or confident enough to address. Yeah. And you have to be willing to say, listen, I don't have all the answers, but let's figure it out together.
And I'm sorry, like there's been absolutely no churches that I've gone to that have on a regular basis taught why they believe certain doctrines. There can be some great verse by verse churches, but they don't regularly go into the doctrine of the Holy Spirit or in-depth resurrection. Like, why do we believe the things we do as the foundation of Christianity? Like turning back to the gospel, the original love. A lot of churches don't do, even for their new members. So expecting people to know why they believe what they believe and no questions should ever come up against that is wrong.
I would argue it's abusive.
Yep.
To say, don't question me because I said so, is abusive.
To an extent, I understand why a lot of churches don't relay the same foundation every year. Like they don't have 2 weeks at the same time each year where they're like, hey, so for all of our new people, all 3 of you, we're going to reteach the entire church why it is we believe what we do. As useful as that could be, I understand why a lot of churches don't do it. At the same time, there are a lot of churches that will have membership courses that are separate from the general Sunday morning services that they have. And during those membership courses, where you're truly becoming a member of the church, that's where they're supposed to be teaching you what it is that the church believes and, more importantly, why it believes it.
Absolutely.
And in those courses, I've taken a few of those over the years. I never got a sense for why.
No.
They just tell you, and then you're like, oh, okay, I guess I believe it.
There seems to be an ulterior motive in the standard American church. And I say this based on my experience in seminary with Cody, because he's a student, I'm also a student, and just reading what other people have experienced as well as what we've experienced in the various churches we've been a part of, and then the friends that we have with different experiences, there seems to be this underlying current in American church where it's like a factory. And you go in and you hear these great promises and it feels really good, like it's appealing. And then maybe you get invited to an event that deepens your relationship with the church, and they invite you to become a member of the church, and you start tithing, and then you have the conversation about serving and where is it best suited for you to serve. And it becomes this assembly line of everybody falls into line and they tithe and they serve and they sit and then they leave. But there's not a lot of depth or equipping. And so they're becoming equipped to grow this church or to fulfill this business goal, but it's not truly ministry and it's not truly being the big C church outside the 4 walls or deepening the faith and relationship between the person and Christ. It's problematic. You run into a lot of issues where people get burnt out because they're doing things and being told like, hey, you're doing this for Jesus. Like, you should have limitless energy. You should have limitless resources. You should go outside of your comfort zone. And if you're really doing it for the Lord, then like you should be fine with it. And if you're not, then your intentions are wrong and you're sinning and you're not a good Christian because you're not feeling the way you need to feel. There's a lot of guilt and shame. And so people are stuck. And it's if I leave, then I'm not loyal. And then I'm a bad Christian because I can't live up to the expectations of my church. But not once have they opened their Bible. Like in the classes, it's what promises can the church or the author make to this person to entice them to continue to give and serve and sit. And we're more worried about butts and seats than we are about the development of the relationship between the person and God. And I've heard way too many sermons where the pastor has given this big point and this declaration and then said, I don't have time to get into the details of why I believe this, but this is the truth and you have to agree with me because I'm telling you so emphatically. And it's not necessarily true.
Turn it into a 15-part series if you need to. But explain. Spend
the time. If you're going to be so emphatic and so deliberate on making this point, follow it up with stuff that backs it. Give your congregation what they need, which is the meat, not just like the fat. Give them the meat.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our podcast today. If you liked what you heard, please feel free to subscribe and share and leave a positive review. And if you would like to connect with us on social media, you can do so on Instagram and Facebook at The Logic of God. You can also send us an email at main.thelogicofgod@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening. We hope you have a great day.